morning, and I'm here today with Edward Bearcroft, who's somebody I've worked with or worked for in the past, and just going to introduce him to you all. Hello, Edward.
Hello, Mark. How are you?
I'm awesome. All the better for chatting to you on this week before Christmas. So look, Edward, I've asked you to have a chat with me today because we've had some very, very interesting conversations in the past around subjects of change and whatever, but let me just tell people a little bit about you first so that they know who we're talking about, and then I'll let you go talk a little bit more on the subject. But I worked with Edward a few years back now with a large change project in the city in a financial organisation. And Edward, I mean, I have to say that I can count on one hand the number of leaders I've worked with in the past that have who've been what I would call an inspiring Agile leader, and you are one of them. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mark. That's very kind of you to say so.
Well, yeah, there we go. I'm just a very kind person.
Of course, we know that. Yeah.
Yes, well, there we go. So Edward, it'd be great just for you to let the audience know, who you are and maybe how you got involved with Agile. And what I've got here for people who are watching the webinar, I've got my little Kanban board to help me keep me on track for the conversation. So I will have occasion be looking up here and taking things off the board and going from there. So let's take the first one off the board. So how did you get involved with Agile then, Edward?
Well, it goes back a way. So back in about 2004, I joined Fidelity, and they were very keen on Agile when I arrived. And I went and did some training in a novel method called DSDM with a company called Radtech, who I believe you know and you're familiar with. And I thought it was awesome. I've been doing IT in a traditional way, shall we say, with project management and so on for quite some time. And I thought this Agile thing was tremendous. It solved a lot of the problems that I'd witnessed. So that's how I sort of got involved. We had a few Agile teams. In the process, we moved some things to India. Interesting things go on in that state. And I mean, so it was a good experience for me. Possibly others took other things from it. But I thought it was it's a positive thing. I was very sort of minded to Agile. I suppose in the end, I don't want to say it failed, but we introduced things into Agile which made it less good than it ought to be. And we converted less people than need to be on the journey for it to be successful.
So what would you say those things were?
Well, so for me, firstly, it sort of started in the IT department. And in some sense, they weren't important enough to make people outside it really listen. I mean, some of them said they did, but they didn't really. And there's some outside the IT department said they did think it was a good thing. But mostly people said, this Agile thing's all very well, but it doesn't seem very different to what we had before because we're not really getting anything anyway. And they weren't really engaged. And we also did some things to it that I think, in hindsight, don't help. So we, first of all, we put a sort of project management layer over the top of it. And so you had your sort of Prince 2 stages and a method for getting through that process. But I think all too often that leads you into lengthy requirements phases, not getting things done and so on. So that's a problem. Some good things as well. We did put in place better technology and better machinery and better disciplines around it. And that's a really good thing in any situation. Another big thing I saw, which actually Agile only sort of had an answer for, was I met the people in our US business who did user experience design. And I thought that was a really awesome thing to do that we'd never done before. Where before people sort of, they analysed what people wanted and you made it. And then the users complained a lot. And the user experience design people had the novel idea about asking the users what they'd really need and then showing it to them, maybe prototyping and testing it. And that was really good. And I learned a lot in the approach that a UX designer has to design of an experience for a customer, which is highly relevant to Agile. I think the problem we saw was they tended to go, Agile's for the IT people. We designers need a more refined world to live in. And when we've done our designs, we'll hand it over to you and you can make it. And, we sort of work that out within the context of the life cycle of project. But I think that's probably a bad thing. And we made it work okay. But my now hindsight or whatever tells me that now that's not really the way to go, doing big design up front, followed by big build out back. probably leads to some problems that we all know about.
Yeah.
But it was good. The UX people were very valuable. And, what was interesting was how, but of course, the bad thing they introduced was this new department that people could disagree with. So that's the problem with all these things, really, that I think Agile should solve, but often doesn't, is that lots of departments are more interested in arguing with each other than actually doing things together. And and that probably is where, we didn't go as far in that era as I'd like to have. We did some good things, but not, where getting to that ideal good is the place we want to get to. So I don't want to say it's failed Agile, but it wasn't perfect Agile. I came out of it thinking, not really, happy, but more can be done. So that's where I started.
Okay. Well, look, there's already some interesting things you start to talk about there. And you're talking about them setting up this department and then everyone could disagree with them. And, disagreement isn't such a bad thing. But one of the key principles, I think, that surrounds Agile and Agile ways of working is this whole thing about collaboration. And people are too busy, I think, setting up their own stall, creating their own versions of Agile. And this is the gospel that we're now going to obey. So hence, one of my other conversations up here is Agile versus agility. So the idea that, look, we have a process in place, and I could ask you a lot more questions about DSDM and having helped put DSDM in place in many places in the past. It's interesting to hear how you went backwards maybe to the whole Prince 2 thing, because DSDM already has something that sits over the top, but it's very lightweight, but yet it's robust enough for corporate strength. So, but hence we go now talk about agility, the organization being agile, organizational agility. And as I mentioned in my book a number of times. So agility, do you want to talk a little bit more about that then? Because there were some things we talked about earlier about how it's not just about in the IT department.
Well, I'll touch on what you said about disagreement. So I was using disagreement in a somewhat amusing way, or trying to be amusing. But I mean, it masks a never getting to the point thing, whereby disagreement, as you say, is very positive. But it needs to be dealt with in a positive way. And disagreement should lead to compromise. And from compromise, we'll make progress. I think there seems to be a lot of that not compromising going on in the world at the moment. But I think that getting people to compromise and to move forward and make stakes in the ground as they move forward is super important. And that's a foundation, I suppose, of agility, is this idea that there's a diverse set of opinions which need to be marshalled relatively quickly, very quickly, and moved on with, and dismiss the ones that don't matter right now. It's interesting, stop it, and take the ones that do matter right now. Let's resolve it and move it. So I like that. But I think in terms of organizational agility, the thing that was interesting in the next company I moved to was really that the top, well, actually, when we started, as you know, Mark, I brought you in to help us with making us more agile in some of the domains that felt they needed it because they wanted to be digital. But probably they didn't want it as much as they thought they did once they saw reality.
Yeah.
And so we found ourselves, I think it's fair to say, and we reflect on this a bit, doing agile but not being agile, trying to be agile but failing to make the breakthrough. But at the same time, having said that, garnering some credits for having a jolly good go at it. And I think what the organization had to get at the top, the need for agility and the solution to delivering agility. So the thing that really changed it for me at that company was when a new COO came in and our new chief digital officer came in, and they were about agility as a way of achieving their business goals. And they completely started with, what are we trying to achieve, and told the story. Forget Agile, although Agile was a thing to achieve. What they were talking about was what they were trying to achieve as a business. And Agile was really the way they were going to get there. Because whilst they knew what they wanted to achieve, like normal, they didn't know exactly all the things they were going to have to do to achieve it. Certainly not 5 years worth of it, but they knew they had a good way of explaining what it was going to turn out like. So I think getting that sort of sponsorship at the top was very important. Not just very important, but the most important thing. And they did a lot, those two individuals, to bring their, not that I was at those sessions myself, but to bring the board. They spent a lot of time talking to the board and behaving with the board in a way that reflected the idea of Agile. we could reflect on whether that was actually successful or not, but it was an important activity. And I think you should, my feeling is everybody should overinvest in that, spending time with your senior leaders.
Yeah.
And, we were talking about this, Mark, that you need to get them to the place where they've experienced Agile and they have kind of an epiphany, rather than that they've read about it or been told about it and know that it's apparently a good thing. But, it's easy to row back from that sort of position. But when you've experienced that epiphany, it's a hallelujah moment and you're off, and you'll really, I think, take it up with much more enthusiasm, and enthusiasm is very important.
Absolutely.
So I think that was a big thing with those guys. I think the second thing that happened with them was, and the context, we brought in, so in order to make it happen for our senior leaders, they felt the need for them to be guided by, if you like, a name in the world. So one of the big consultancies came in and helped with making really more the business case for Agile at the top level. So we had some real business case numbers to track in a sort of Agile way about how we're going to achieve better things with our resources. The big thing that company did was a couple of big things. So I thought that number one, what we concluded, we all worked individually in our departments with this big company, but they said that number one, let's get the strategy straight. So I think having the strategy of the areas I was working, not just set out in woolly broad terms, but set out in quite detailed terms of what parts of the organization needed to be changed for what outcome. And we were going to organize around that. So we actually fixed on 4 specific capabilities that had to be transformed in order to deliver the kind of experience for customers that they were targeting. So, they were moving on the axis of a better customer experience and a more focused product will allow us to gather more customers and gather more business. And the capabilities that we had in there were the things that were going to move the dial on that. So that was our sort of organizing principle, the thing that we could set our teams up against. And what we did was then implement, and I give these guys a good credit for, we implemented the system of objectives and key results.
Oh, yeah.
So I did read the book, actually. I read John Doerr's book, which I thought was jolly good. And I was convinced, and he seems to have had some success in a couple of quite successful companies. And so we built the system of objectives and key results to link up to the strategic objectives that set us up. It's really 3 strategic objectives under which you could place any one of our Agile squads. And in fact, you had 3 strategic objectives, 4 capabilities we were focusing on. And every squad aligned between those capabilities and objectives. So that was and the big thing in that was then to make sure that was highly communicated. We didn't just want people, forgetting Agile, we wanted the people to know the purpose of the organization and to know the purpose of the IT and change team in delivering that new organization. So that was a really material part of the journey. And that's what I sort of felt was, and I don't think anybody has to use a big consultancy or whatever, but they tend to have very good people in them. If you can afford, they do charge a bit. But what was great was they had this credibility at the leadership level. They could tell the leaders where they needed to go and give them, if you like, cases that proved it. So they got credibility there. And I think, secondly, they had broader knowledge that they could bring to the party about what the business was trying to do. So yes, Agile's the means, not the ends. It's sort of the ends actually in a way, but being adaptable is an important one of your ends. But in the end, really, Agile's the means you get to your ends, and your ends is some form of business success. And so, being a strategy consultancy, they could bring that sort of focus on that. They know the industry, they can tell the story, they can, really figure out that strategy stuff. And I think that's incredibly important to Agile. The things that really came out of that is once you know what you're doing it for, you've got your yardstick against which to make your compromises. Do we do A or B? Well, does it achieve Y or Z better? And you go, well, it achieves Y. Fine, we'll do A then. So the strategy is the means by which you resolve the conflict. It's no longer then about department. It's like, well, whatever your department is, what you're trying to achieve important to the corporate strategy, or isn't it?
Yeah.
We'll do it then. So that's been that's a massive gain once you can have that sort of that. level of focused energy that's channeling all of the organization's energy and resources at it. So that was a very good thing. I think the thing I'll reflect on, failure. It's always failure. Or they say all political careers end in failure. Probably all agile careers end in failure or something. I don't know. But
near Brexit now, are we?
We could be. No. We won't get on. That's a dangerous topic, Mark. But I think the things that OKRs is a great system. I was very enthusiastic about it. It takes a lot of explaining to people, especially in your team. So we put in place a process of quarterly reviews where we said, we had the idea, the model we used, and I like it because it's as an agile model, it's quite non-specific. We use the Spotify model, but what's quite good is it's like, yes, so you work it out for yourselves and use what you want to, use what works. And I'm like, use what works is the thing that really matters from this massive recipe book of great recipes we've got. Let's use recipes that we like the taste of, yes, and the ingredients that we can find that are fresh.
Yes.
So we use Spotify and we use what works. But an OKR, so I'm very enthusiastic about them. We ran a quarterly review process so that we gave our teams autonomy within the strategy. Strategy gave us the alignment. The teams have autonomy to get on with it. And on a quarterly basis, we took our product owners and our business sponsors and our teams, and we reviewed our objectives, and we said, and how did we do with our key results last month, which we've been keeping track of? And what are our key results going to be in the next 3 months? And are we changing any of our objectives? So, a good wavelength, I think, on which to change. But I think, challenging to get people to think hard about what makes a good objective, what's the real result. Sorry?
It takes time.
It takes time, yeah. And you've got to get people to... People have got to get the feel for that. You know what I mean? Well, people are quite used. People say we want autonomy. This is great. Okay. When they've got it, they realise it's a bit harder because they've actually now got to make some decisions and have some beliefs. So, but that's a process to be got through. And I've seen some teams do some amazing things with their autonomy, and in particular, because we all get a bit kind of, we're going to do it this way, and that's I'm the boss. But all I've ever found, and what I've most found, and that perhaps it's just a function of reaching, older age, is the more I know the answer, the more it's a good idea for me not to tell people it. Because if 4 other people have thought of answers too, at least one of them will be better than mine, and probably 4 of them. So I can't really do the telling the answer, but what I can do is give them the encouragement and the support and the takeaway of the things that are real problems. So, yeah.
Yeah, this is awesome, actually, because you raised another point here about autonomy. And as people probably know, my background here is in psychology. And one of the things that you would talk about with people is if you give them more autonomy, that means you give them more freedom of choice. But the more choices you give people, not all people, I think teams that will spend the time and actually think through what their choices are, I think that they are the ones who will do best with it. But for most people, they'll collapse in a heap. With too much choice. It's like, oh my God, where do we go? And sometimes that's where leadership is important. Yeah. And sometimes we have to, and I know some people won't like me for saying this, but sometimes you have to disempower people. You have to take choices away from them. Say, look, think about whatever you want, but this is what we're going to do. And for instance, in this instance, we are going to use the Spotify model. Yes, we're told by Spotify not to use the model, because it's about building a culture. And you talked about something there earlier, the whole being agile versus doing agile. That's absolutely awesome. I think your agile is the means, agility is the end. Is where you want to get to.
Oh, I like that. That's a good work on that one, Mark. I think
I like it too.
Nice.
Generative conversations, you see, Edward. That's what we do.
We like that.
So there was something that you mentioned, and I'd love you to talk a little bit about this. And it's the serve to lead conversation because you're an ex-Sandhurst man, aren't you?
Well, yes. So I joined the army a long time ago, 35 years ago, actually.
Wow.
37 years ago. That dates me. But and I joined this august institution, Sandhurst, and the motto is "Serve to Lead." And I didn't really understand that at the time. I'm in charge. I'm the boss. I've got a pip on my shoulder. But once you've experienced being in an army platoon or an army whatever, you discover that your job as an officer is to sort life out for the guys that you're privileged enough to be the officer of. Your job is to serve them. You eat last. You make sure that they get their kit sorted. You help them with whatever they need helping with. Your job is a servant. And you realise if you don't do that and you start telling people what to do, and let's face it, they'll be much more experienced than you in the things you're going to be doing. You don't do very well. It goes down quite badly. And being a bunch of blokes, they can be quite tricky on you if you behave like like a dick, really. That goes down very badly. So I hope that's not too rude for this podcast, Mark. But that
was perfectly fine.
But no. So I learned about that servant leadership, and it stayed with me because these things you experience do. So when we set up our Agile team, so we set up our tribe with squads and chapters and communities of practice. And then we went, so what are we going to do with the management team? So some of them we didn't need anymore. So we didn't have any project managers. We gave everybody the opportunity to apply for other roles. But some people, it wasn't for them, and that was fine. And I think we had a very reasonable and sensible conversation. But with those that were the management team, and I made my management team, my Agile coaches, my chapter leads, they were the management team. And then the other team we had was our what I call portfolio enablement team, and they were really the people to face off to the old organisation. They had to do the reporting. They actually also had a service mentality. Help our teams get stuff reported. Help us get money for projects we want to do. Help us get the people onboarded when we need them. All those service things that you need doing to run a tight ship that people do value having running well. When you turn up, you get a laptop immediately. Everybody knows you're here. You run all the systems. It's good. And that's what that team was for. And then the management team, we existed really to create the environment for these teams to perform in. So, we're the sort of performance team for that Agile tribe. So that was our goal, and we sort of set ourselves the process of implementing our Spotify model in an Agile fashion, starting with an MVP. So we set ourselves some objectives, and we had some key results. Simple one being that an objective. A key result was we'd have an organisation in place, and we'd have told everybody what their role was in it, and they would understand it. And that was part of, I forget what the objective was. The objective of probably just, I can't remember which objective it was for, but the point was we set ourselves a very, very clear result that we were going to work on, and we'd know when we'd achieved it, and we were doing that for the team. And I think the fact that we as a management team were setting ourselves the mission of being like that, helped us to tell everybody else we're in it too. So it's that setting the example at the top and experiencing it. So that was our my principle in that was that one of servant leadership. So we drew our org chart with those two teams at the bottom of the pile as opposed to at the top. So we were the platform on which the Agile squads and chapters could operate. And that's a sort of important symbol, is that we're here to help you guys.
That makes sense.
Symbols count. And so we don't want to tell you what to do, but we want to enable you to do great business. The other thing we really wanted to make sure we did, and important role of leadership, the communication bit. So we've got to communicate what the business is about. We've got to communicate why we're doing the things we're doing, and we've got to communicate what it means for those of us who are on the journey to be more agile. What are we trying to do in that? What sort of a culture does that want to create? Are we getting that culture? Do we all like that culture? So we spend a lot of time thinking about that. So we felt that was something, we could carry on doing for a long time. So every quarter we reviewed our objectives and our key results, and we set ourselves some new ones. That's really the job to do, I think, for management in the modern era is create the pitch, create the environment, make sure your people are well equipped, trained, comfortable, happy, talking to each other, having arguments, resolving arguments. These are, and then of course separating them from the politics. I think but not so much insulating from the politics as resolving the politics if possible. Yeah. So the danger is you live in a bubble, and I know that guy Michael Sahota, I think it is. He says you can live in an agile bubble. I don't think you can really. You've really got to. You can't insulate yourself. Maybe he didn't mean that. I just heard him say it. I think you were at that meeting too. And I thought, you've got to engage with the world around you, and you've got to do it quite deeply, actually. And our mission was really to convert the world around us. So we said we were agile, that we were changing the way we were doing change, but we actually took some of the business areas. What we really wanted to change the way we do business. So we integrated some of our operational areas with our team. So if you looked at the data team, nobody would have known the difference between the people whose responsibility was to manage and distribute data to customers in operations and the people whose job was to build applications that would help them do that. They were all really tightly integrated. So that was really that was the destination, is changing the way you do business. But you've got to start somewhere.
Oh, absolutely. So these are interesting points as well, because as you and I both know, I think we rated that transformation certainly as better than some of the ones we'd seen in the past. Because I think you mentioned Fidelity earlier, and I know when I got involved with Fidelity, I think they were on their 5th reinvention of Agile, because they kept taking one step forward, 2 steps back, one forward, two. So by the time we left the organization, and I worked for a company called Enlighten, who came in and actually did some work afterwards. We went and trained the top 350 managers, and I think that's where we might have met first. When I was. But certainly where the transformation you're referring to now, it sort of did hit some hiccups, doesn't it? And I think we mentioned earlier this notion, this idea that I talk about in the book about subject-object, where the leaders were subjecting the organization to change, and the object of the change was you guys over there, you guys down there. But even with this big consultancy that was brought in, there was a small mention, in small words, about leadership development. And yet, what happened there? Because from what I could gather, there wasn't very much of it done, and hence the leaders weren't the object of the change at that point. They still wanted to subject people to the change.
I think that's just super important, Mark. I think I was talking about the book I read about crises.
Oh yes.
So the book Upheaval, written by Jared Diamond, who's tremendous. It's a tremendous book, but it's about nations seen through the eyes of a psychologist. He's not a psychologist; his wife is. He's just a polymath. But he says that and he looked at various nations, Germany, Japan, and Korea, and other places, and talked about their recent history through all of the nations that had a crisis. And Germany being what's interesting, and you're a psychologist, so you know these things, Mark. But apparently, the crisis is the thing, and the question is what happens after the crisis, and actually change has to occur. Yeah. And if change doesn't occur, which reflects on the pre-crisis situation and resolves it, you don't move on. And so he relates that in Germany, the Germans moved on from the Second World War by really dealing with the pre-war crisis and going and setting up memorial centres for the Holocaust that they took all their school children to, and genuinely repenting. And Germany's great success as a modern country is because it dealt with its crisis. So, and I was riffing on this, Mark, but I feel like this is the case for organisations, is you need the crisis. And if you don't fight the battle of Agile, and then end up post-crisis having dealt with the pre-crisis issues, which I think are crises of management, actually, management and leadership. Yes. You won't move forward. You'll still have, that's what would otherwise happen, is you'll have the same people in charge. It's okay with the same people, but the same unchanged people in charge, wondering why nothing's really changed. It's probably, this is probably pretty normal. Anyways, I think this is what goes on in a lot of Agile transformation. It tells you, of course, that's a very tough task, because you've got to be a very determined leader to change all the many interested parties around you. It's hard. They won't be happy about it.
Oh, absolutely. But they might not be happy about it. We see that, but that's the point, and it's rather subtle, isn't it? The idea that the leader has to change people is a bit of a misnomer, because they can't change anyone. I often say to people, look, I'm probably one of the world's best coaches, and that's not being too over dramatic, but actually I've never changed anybody. What I do is I ask people to have conversations. We have dialogue about change, and then they see, well, what change do I want? So and sometimes I hate this word, empower people to go off and actually make the change that they want. So culture change happens within the teams. And yes. There's never one culture for the whole organization. There's multiple cultures. And then asking the team to say, well, look, how do you want to evolve your culture? What's important to you? And the leader, like you said earlier, provides the platform, provides the mechanisms. They put in place the correct systems, processes, and everything else, the stuff that they really have control of in the organization. And I say control because they really do control it. So hence, subjecting people to the change. It has to be done in a different way. And the idea, if they can put themselves forward and say, 'cause again, you were one of the few people I've come across in my career, Edward, who actually had their own coach that was actually helping them through the time of the change in the organisation. I remember you introduced me to a very nice lady whose name I can't remember. But but it was very, very important, I thought, because here was I speaking to you thinking, well, look, Edward, I can't coach you because I'm working for you, but who's your coach? I've got a coach. Oh, whoa, really? Awesome. Because again, like I say, one hand, the number of people who do that say, look, I'm the mechanism of change. I need to change myself. And I understand that I've got to get better if my team's going to get better. And then you become that mentor, that paradigm that people would want to look at and shift towards, to say, well, look, if they're changing, then change is good enough for them. It's good enough for me. And that's part of the servant bit that I see as well, that we have to be a little bit more humble ourselves as leaders. And then this crisis that you refer to, absolutely, that will go away. But there's another point you mentioned there, and again, to draw on another book, which I've talked about in my book, is an excellent one called Beyond Change Management by Ackerman Anderson. And they posit that actually transformation doesn't happen unless you have two things. Two things being the wake-up call, and you might have multiple wake-up calls, and I think you call them crises there. But they have to wake up. They can't just sleepwalk over the edge of the cliff, because if they do, they're doomed. But then that's the next thing, is that they have to change. And these authors who, in this book, Beyond Change Management, they talk about conscious transformation. Yet they say, look, it's the leaders who have to lead that change. Leaders go first. But I like what you said earlier. Leaders eat last. So, but they need to change first.
So you might eat last, but you go over the top first, right? So you're you're shot first. So there's a difference of things. Yeah, but I think that's quite actually interesting thing you sort of noted there, I think, Mark. So what my coach taught me about was, she talked about eco leadership versus ego leadership. That was a very helpful thing, and it's quite interesting. I think I like this idea of things are the same in whichever layer you're in somehow. But as a psychologist, I guess, and I'm positing what you do, I don't know. It's all mystery to me. But I think you're creating a personal environment for a person which allows them to change. Their personal environment is the ideas and thoughts and notions they have, and they use that to make their change. But you help them with giving them the vehicle for change. The ideas and behaviour and skills they might need to do that. You can coach that. They have to use them for their change. And I think it's the same at the team level. It's the same at the organisation level. It's the same at the country level. That creation of the environment of things we can use to make our own personal transformation. So it's those and it's the ideas. It's the words do help a lot. I really liked eco versus ego leadership. I like that. And I thought that the job of creating a good environment. What's interesting is organisations tend to be looking for ego leaders. Yeah. Because they interview for ego leaders. It's like, it's not hard if you're quite bouncy like me. You can do the ego thing. But the problem is it doesn't actually create great organisations in the modern world. And maybe it never did. So I think that sort of. But it's more valued probably than it ought to be. Because it's seen as getting stuff done and telling your story and stuff.
Yeah, well, you see, again, this builds very well on Bill Joyner's view of the agile leader or leadership agility, as he refers to it. Because in parallel to this whole agile movement, Bill was looking. It's actually Bill and Stephen who wrote their book, Leadership Agility. They talk about experts or expert leaders, and experts are the ones who say, well, look, I know what I'm talking about. And as you and I know, Edward, I used to work for one of these big consultancies, and it was full of these experts who wanted to tell people what it is they had to do. And they didn't spend by far long enough trying to understand the pains of the organization, what it was going through, and help them to probably diagnose their problems more effectively, rather than saying, well, look, we got a solution, and here it's this wonderful method that we're going to plant on you. And it's, well, we've got a solution for everything, and it's the one thing. It's just like, tell us what your problem is, and we'll make it fix. And I don't think that really works.
Well, that's why I go back to the UX people. I learned a lot from these guys. And one of the things we did was this thing called design thinking.
Oh, yeah.
And so, and design thinking, it comes out of adopting the mindset of the designer. And really, what do designers do? Well, they solve problems. with tools at their disposal. But the first thing to do is to stop getting your solution in the way of solving the problem. Go and find out more about the problem. And so this is actually one of the things, again, we did in our Agile transformation. We said, well, and this is a great thing about, I was talking to you, we were saying about how the UX team lived a bit separate from the delivery teams. But I kind of go, no, we're all solving user problems. I mean, I saw my Agile squads as users of our services as a management team, right? So the question is, what user problem do they have? And actually, we had a chat with them about it. And they said, well, our user problem is, I'm not getting the right training, or I'm not in a team that gets on very, very well, or I've got a business partner that doesn't want to work with me. Well, I could solve that. So I think, that exactly as you're saying there, this deepening your understanding of the problem. And then you're obviously using the tools at your disposal. And Agile is a rich set of tools and practices and ideas that you can bring to it. But bring the ones that are going to work for your problem in your context, not the ones that are going to work for everybody else. So I think that idea of design thinking, and the big thing about design thinking is deepen your understanding of the problem, try out a solution. If it doesn't work very well, learn from it and iterate. So it's about but go back to the problem. When I've created my solution, don't invest too much time in creating my solution. The problem with investing time in a solution is you then become attached to it. Yes. You don't want to be attached to stuff. You need to discard things easily. Yeah. So because that's what when your big idea is going wrong, you just get more deeply attached to it if you're not careful. Yeah, I think this is one of the big Agile things is, if it stops working, stop doing it. Just because it worked in the past doesn't make it good. Yeah. So I think we had a lot of that dynamic of the design idea of how we design the organization and process to fit with the problem we're solving, rather than the problem that somebody else had. So Google solved their problem in X way. It doesn't mean to say that every other company is going to solve the same way. Yeah, we've got different contexts. All of us old economy companies, I think, those of us who work in the old economy that are trying to turn to new economy, it's a classic one. You wouldn't start here really if you had a choice. You'd probably hire some different people and give them different skills and do a different job. But you do start here. So, you've got to deal with where you begin, not where you'd like to begin from.
Oh, exactly. That's part of the consultant's role, isn't it? To see, look, where are you now? Not where you think you are or where you'd like to say you are. Because, again, I remember in one of these organizations that there was a sort of a self-assessment on how agile do you think you are? Well, surprisingly, everybody thinks they're really agile, but they don't even know what it means. But hey, that's a different conversation for another day. So look, Edward, we've got a couple of minutes left, and I just want to take these last little things off my Kanban board so I can have a nice empty frame at the end of it. So changing how we do business, and customer at the heart. I mean, I think that's exactly what you're talking about there, the whole design thinking, understanding the users and all that. So was there anything else you wanted to say on that?
Well, I think so what we were actually looking at our sort of organising idea for what we can do as Agile. And I said, well, it's obviously we'll just use the customer journey. We'll organise around the customer journey. It's going to be awesome. And that is a very good organising idea, organised around the discrete life cycle of customers. But we realised that wasn't going to work for everybody. So we had to think of a slightly different organising idea. We still had the customer journey in mind. And I think, getting back to who's the user and what do they need is really where what are their problems and what do they need to solve them with? This is where it all begins. Yeah. So we slightly, still within the idea of customer journey, we focused on these capabilities, the stuff we do to enable the customer. But it was easier for people to get their heads around because they were used to that kind of way of looking at things. In an ideal world, I'd still have chosen to say, we'll go and work on customer problems and only be driven by that. There we go. The problem with that is the bean counters really. You go, well, you're not really telling me what you make. It doesn't look, projects seem to be make a capability and then use it to see if you solve the customer's problem. I'd love to have got further down the road. Yeah. It basically meant we're working on the internal user's problem, and that's okay. So, you found this that we needed to improve our sales productivity really. So, how do you do that? Well, you start with talking to a salesperson, strange enough, and say, tell me about what your problems are. And I mean, we had some amazing things where developers often say, I want to talk to the users, and project managers say, no, get on with developing. I'll tell you what the users want. Yeah. You know how, and of course, but in one of our squads, they were working on sales data and getting sales data in good shape. And so they focused in on the needs of one team and one user, and what do you want to achieve? We're going to make the whole organization really productive. But first, let's solve your one most important problem. We're going to do it in 2 weeks. So they navigated to that one most important problem. And now you've got a world where the developer is having a chat with the sales manager who's going to use the thing the developer makes. And the product owner, and I think product owners are a tremendous invention. That we could mention that actually. We brought product owners from the business rather than product owners from a product world. We took people who worked. We had a salesperson who did the product owner for the sales product. And you know what? Even though she didn't know so much about product owning, she's a magic product owner.
Yeah.
And, that counted for so much. You can be trained in the product management, product ownership stuff. You can't be trained in what it's like in the real sales department we're going to work for. So, but, when we got to that world where I've got, the sales manager talking to the developer about what his priority is and this one thing we've zeroed in on that we're going to get done by next Wednesday, the magic conversation. But also that very small thing, that's the beginning of the journey, is related to the thing we want to achieve, which is substantially more sales productivity as measured by our objectives and key results. So if I repeat that one thing 52 times over the rest of the next 2 years, I'll be miles along the curve. It'll be magic, and that's I think is the thing is when you get to those small interactions being super successful, but small interactions that match to the big picture you painted, that you can draw a lineage between. That's a beautiful thing, yeah?
No, absolutely. And again, you speak wonderfully there about it because, as you say, just to nail that point home, the product owners are the ones who know the business. And I'm not a fan of proxies, of people coming in who then they refuse to backfill the role and all that sort of stuff. And you just end up with communication latency. But the idea then of how you use your coaches help those people to become better product owners. The coach can actually bring that and inject that rather than the coach being the agile police, who goes off and beats people over the head if they're not following a process. That's not what their job is at all.
Well, the great thing about
learning journey.
Good product owners, in my view, are again create space for their team to operate in. So bad ones tend to want to control the whole agenda, and become they can end up becoming like the king or queen.
Sure.
What they want to create, they want to lead from the lead. They want to practice eco leadership, and so and let things away. It's that letting go and leaving other people to make their way, even make their own mistakes. It's a very, very, very good feature.
No, absolutely. It works so well. So look, one last thing, because we just have rattled through the other things there as we were talking about them. And I've got it down here as where does it go wrong? So could you just give us a quick summary then about if you had your time again, what are, say, maybe 3 things that you'd go and do differently?
Yeah, so I mean, number one, I would go and spend more time advocating and showing more people in the organisation what this is about and why it matters. So, I mean, of course, it's always easy to believe it's the greatest thing ever, but I really believe that old economy companies that don't embrace the new, we'll call them agile ways of operating and working, will not be here in 10 years' time, unless they're very lucky and live in very uncompetitive sectors. Yeah, and there are some of those. But I really doubt, there's so much going on. One of the many fund management companies will become much more agile. One of the many insurance companies, or a number of them will, and they'll take it over. Or the new economy companies will come in and take over that space. So it just seems to me too good not to be successful. Yeah. So I would tell that story 100 more times, but also provide evidence 100 more times. So I think, the difficult thing is getting people to believe. People project linear progress, but it's not linear. Unfortunately, it's S-curve shaped progress. The thing about Agile is at the beginning, you're on the bottom of the S-curve. Yeah. And so your first steps in getting that one feature for that one business user that's built on a great architecture. And I don't think we should underplay the role of engineering. I think doing great engineering is super important. We don't want Agile to be rubbish engineering. That would be a terrible thing. And I don't think we mentioned that enough, actually, Mark, in a way. So my first thing is tell the story more and give more evidence. My second thing would be engineers really matter, and the role of engineer and the job of engineer in an engineering agile context. And of course, we can apply agile to many things. It doesn't have to have engineering in it at all. But but in the world I was in, engineering was an important part of the solution. And I think it's extremely important that we build a fantastic community of engineers who are highly business aware, care a lot about the business they're doing. I saw a good article where one of my engineers showed me about the idea of the product engineer, but engineers that know at least as much about the business as the business do themselves. Yeah. They're very powerful, these guys. This is a very, very incredibly useful skill set. So telling more people about it in the leadership area and giving them evidence, really focusing on engineers, that might be any of your, what I call makers. I mean, generally speaking, it's focusing on the important skills that make your product. That can't be substituted for amateur skills. It needs to be highly professional and extremely good at what it does. So if in an agile accountancy, I guess, you'd make sure the accountants were really valued for what they did in accounting. So that's the second thing. And the third thing, boy, now you put me... I think in the end, so you have to continue to beat yourself up, really. So I suppose the thing is, the rate at which you learn is your limiting factor, and almost all learning involves giving up the things you used to believe and hadn't learned yet. And some of that is quite dented. It's quite bashed into you. So I'd have given up on. I mean, interestingly, and again, another one we talked about. Project managers aren't bad people, but I'd have given up on having project managers sooner. But they provided a useful vehicle for telling people what was going on. So you know what I mean? They provide a way of insulating yourself from all the noise that's happening in the world. But I think those people, those skills can be better utilised as product owners and turned into servant leaders, not sort of kingly rulers or queenly rulers. They don't need to be monarchs anymore. They need to be enablers, and that's the big difference. So I'd certainly have. I think those are my three things. Yeah. Telling the story more to the leaders and getting them on board properly with real evidence. And I probably didn't do enough evidence. You've got to believe it so much that your CFO will sign the checks when it comes down to it. Yeah?
Yes, makes sense.
So that's really important. Yeah, valuing your makers and the skills they do use to make things with, really important. And then myself, making sure that my rate of learning, my rate of overcoming my mistaken beliefs is fast enough. So those are my three things. Yeah.
I like the way you just put that last bit in there, because as I was reflecting on what you were saying about learning, I was going to suggest that actually there's some unlearning that needs to be done. You just touched on it there about what your beliefs are. So sometimes we have to let go of the things we know that are keeping us stuck in the past. So there's some unlearning in order to learn new stuff, because sometimes there's that dissonance, that conflict that will exist. That unless we let go of this, we can't embrace this. So I think that's a fair shout.
Yeah, and that's difficult. Those are probably the hardest things to unlearn, because they're not just learned; they're quite deeply felt.
They're embedded. They're habits. You have to break and change habits, and that's why I believe personally leaders need to have their own coaches, because the coach then will hold the mirror up for them to say, do you realize that when you're out talking to the organization, you're always talking about yourself? They're not interested in you. They really aren't. They want to hear about how you're going to make their lives better for them. So, and I think that is probably one of the major lessons I think that leaders of these traditional organizations need to learn, because their lunch is going to be eaten by all these upstart organizations that are coming through, because we're living in this VUCA world right now that things are so volatile and uncertain, and they're certainly complex and ambiguous. So,
and their leaders don't behave like that. Their leaders aren't that kind of leadership, are they? They're not out there being, the ones that are come unstuck. I mean, look at the guy that ran Uber. Or WeWork. I think as soon as your ego gets ahead of yourself in the modern world, you're in trouble. Your employees will sort you out by not really doing it for you anymore.
So that's one of my big takeaways from this. Is the eco versus ego, and I love that. Because I've got a friend of mine who talks about eco all the time, and I'll be interviewing him in a few weeks' time. Sai, who talks a lot about eco, and we're not about the ego at all. We try and help subjugate the ego, put the ego down, because ego is useful. It helps us to survive, but it's not the be all and end all.
Yeah, I was going to say, well, you're a psychologist, so you'll be all over this ego thing, right? You'll be able to
like a rash, as you
pick me apart on that front, Mark. Pick me apart after this meeting, though, please, not in public.
Well, no, definitely not in public. We're all about edifying our leaders, not pulling them down. So that's not good. So, Edward, look, thank you so much for your time. I've really loved and enjoyed this conversation. I've got a whole bunch of things here that are going to write up afterwards as I do some editing around this. And so I'm sure at some point in the future, do you have contact details that you'd like people to?
Yeah, no. If people want to get in touch with me, then they can. They can track me down on LinkedIn. So I'm Edward Bearcroft on LinkedIn. Okay. Only one of them, as I understand it. Or edward@bearcroft.net will be the suitable email address to contact me at.
Awesome. Well, I'll put a little note up at the end of this little video thingy so people can see that. And Edward, it's been wonderful. Going to wish you a Merry Christmas now. And
Merry Christmas too, Mark.
Thank you very much, sir.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.